What happens when the hero becomes the monster? Kyle Crane isn't sure himself anymore, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes Dying Light the Beast the most psychological compelling entry in the franchise yet. Picture this, your Kyle Crane escaped after 13 brutal years of experimentation. Your captor, a clinical sadist called the Baron, has pumped you full of zombie DNA. Now every choice you make, every time you give in to the monstrous power growing inside you, it pushes you further from humanity. It's not just survival horror anymore, it's existential dread with parkour mechanics. The Beast isn't trying to reinvent zombie games, instead is doing something far more interesting, perfecting what made the original Dying Light terrifying while asking whether power always comes at the cost of your soul. Here's where the development story gets fascinating. The Beast started as a DLC for Dying Light 2, probably a quick cash grab to keep players engaged while Techland figured out their next big move. But somewhere during development they realized they had something bigger. What began as additional content grew into a standalone 20-hour campaign with another 20 to 30 hours of optional content that is launching on September 18, 2025. That one day early release after hitting 1 million pre-orders, that's not just marketing, it's confidence. This is Techland betting their reputation on a focused vision rather than sprawling ambition. The fact that Dying Light 2 Stay Human Ultimate Edition owners get the Beast for free tells us everything about Techland priorities. They're not just selling a product, they're trying to win back trust from a community that felt burned by Dying Light 2's bloated complexity. Sometimes the best way forward is admitting you took a wrong turn and correcting it hard. This pivot from DLC to standalone represents something crucial in modern game development. The courage to recognize when you have something special and give it the room to breathe, even when the safer play would be packaging it as a premium DLC and just moving on. Kyle Crane's return could have been a pure fan service, bringing back a beloved character. Instead, Techland has crafted something far more psychologically complex. After 13 years of torture by the Baron, a detached scientist who treats human beings like lab rats, Crane emerges fundamentally changed. He's carrying zombie DNA in his bloodstream, and every time he activates Beast Mode, he risks losing more of who he used to be. Roger Craig Smith's returning voice performance carries a weight that suggests a real consideration of what sustained trauma does to someone. And the Baron isn't your typical villain, he represents something more insidious. The scientific mind that views suffering as data, humans as test subjects. His chimera creations, the grotesque boss enemies that serve as both gameplay challenges and narrative symbols, embody this philosophy. They're what happens when someone brilliant decides other people's humanity expendable for the sake of progress. But here's what makes this setup brilliant. Beast Mode isn't just a power fantasy mechanic. Every time you transform, you're not just choosing a gameplay strategy. You're deciding who Crane is becoming. The question isn't whether Crane will survive his ordeal. It's whether anything recognizably human will remain when the dust settles. Castor Woods represents the game's most significant departure from franchise's formula. And it's a masterstroke. We're leaving the vertical urban parkour playgrounds of previous games for something that feels more Twin Peaks than typical zombie apocalypse. Rural, alpine-inspired regions dotted with tourist towns, forests, swamps, and industrial decay. Rural horror is different from urban survival. Cities promise escape routes, vertical options, the possibility that around the next corner lies safety. In the woods, in isolated tourist towns surrounded by dark forests, claustrophobia becomes psychological rather than physical. You might have more space, but you also have fewer options and far less hope of rescue. The addition of 4x4 vehicles acknowledges this reality while maintaining survival tension through brilliant design constraints. These aren't invincible escape pods, they need fuel, they break down, they're loud enough to attract every nasty thing in the area. Parkour remains central but adapted to rural topography means different challenges entirely. Instead of scaling apartment buildings, you're navigating cliff faces, forest canopies, and abandoned industrial structures. It feels familiar enough for series veterans while offering genuinely fresh scenarios that justify this standalone release. But here's where the Beast gets mechanically fascinating and potentially problematic. The central gameplay loop revolves around hunting chimeras to harvest their DNA and unlock new Beast abilities. It's elegant in concept. Face your fears to gain power, but every victory pushes you further from humanity. The risk-reward system forces engagement with the game's most dangerous encounters. You can't progress Beast abilities by playing it safe, which creates a fascinating tension. Do you rely on human Crane's parkour, stealth and firearms, staying true to who he was but remaining limited? Or do you embrace the monster inside, becoming more powerful but potentially losing yourself in the process? But here's my concern. Will this actually create meaningful choice? Or will beast mode just become the optimal strategy players always use? Preview coverage hasn't fully addressed how overpowered these abilities might be, especially in 4-player co-op scenarios. There's a real risk that what's intended as a psychological tension could devolve into power fantasy optimization. The survival emphasis, which is weapon fragility, resource scarcity, genuinely threatening knights, suggests that Techland understands this danger. By making survival legitimately challenging, they're betting that players will feel the weight of every beast mode activation instead of treating it as a casual gameplay tool. If they've balanced this correctly, the beast could represent a new gold standard for meaningful player choice in horror games. If not, it risks undermining its own psychological themes through mechanical convenience. From a design philosophy standpoint, the Beast represents a fascinating industry experiment. In an era of 100-hour open worlds and endless content loops, Techland is betting that sometimes smaller really is better, especially in horror. Dying Light 2 was ambitious but often felt diluted. Too many systems, too much scope, not enough focus on the core experience that made the original special. The Beast's more intimate approach, 20 hours instead of 80, a single region instead of sprawling cities, personal trauma instead of faction politics, suggests hard-won wisdom about what actually makes their game work. This philosophy extends to every design choice. Weapon fragility forces tactical flexibility. Vehicle maintenance prevents cars from solving traversal permanently. Limited resources make every encounter feel consequential. These aren't the difficulty spikes, they're deliberate discomfort designed to maintain a horror atmosphere. It's a risky strategy in today's market. Players increasingly expect massive content volumes for their money. But if the Beast succeeds, it could prove that focused experiences can compete with bloated spectacles, and that sometimes the best way to innovate is to perfect what you already do well rather than constantly chasing trends. The community response to the Beast has been a fascinating study in franchises' loyalty and modern game expectations. Kyle Crane's return generated genuine excitement. He's a more beloved protagonist than many initially realized, but the DLC to standalone transition sparked legitimate skepticism. Some players initially felt cheated, wondering why they should pay full price for what began as a DLC. The free copy for Dying Light 2 Ultimate Edition owners has largely addressed this concern, but it highlights broader tensions about how modern games are packaged and sold. Timeline placement has created its own debates among lore enthusiasts. Officially set between Dying Light 1 and 2, the Beast raises continuity questions that preview coverage hasn't fully answered. How does Crane's transformation connect to the established canon? What does this mean for the broader franchise's timeline? These discussions reveal a community genuinely invested in narrative coherence, something Techland should take as a compliment. The Beast mode balance remains the biggest question mark. Preview coverage consistently mentions its power, but rarely addresses potential downsides. Will it trivialize human abilities? How will co-op balance work when one player goes full monster? These aren't just mechanical concerns, they're fundamental questions about the game's thematic integrity. What's encouraging is that these debates exist at all. A disengaged community doesn't argue about timeline placement or mechanical balance. The fact that players care enough to debate these details suggests that the Beast has already succeeded in recapturing franchise investment. In conclusion, Dying Light the Beast isn't trying to revolutionize zombie games or chase industry trends. Instead, it's attempting something arguably more difficult. This represents exactly what the franchise needed after Dying Light 2 bloated complexity. But let's be clear about what you're getting. If you want a massive open world with hundreds of hours of content, the Beast will disappoint you. If you're looking for revolutionary gameplay innovations or cutting-edge technical showcases, look elsewhere. This is a game betting that expertly crafted horror atmosphere and meaningful player choice can justify a full-price standalone release. For players who've been missing genuinely frightening zombie games, who remember when survival meant more than inventory management, who want their gameplay choices to carry emotional weight, the Beast could be exactly what you've been waiting for. For everyone else, it's a fascinating experiment in focused game design that could influence how the industry thinks about scope, content, and player engagement. Even if you're not interested in horror games, the Beast's success or failure will tell us important things about whether quality can still compete with quantity in modern gaming. Kyle Crane's journey from hero to monster might just be the mirror the entire industry needs to see its own reflection clearly. Sometimes the most important question isn't whether you can become powerful enough to survive, it's whether you can remain human enough that survival actually matters.